Breaking tonight, Xi Jinping just said it again. And this time, the world can no longer pretend it didn't hear him. The stakes are rising across the Indo-Pacific tonight. China has been quietly, and not so quietly, rearming for decades. And while Western politicians debated, while economists argued, while commentators dismissed the warnings as alarmism, Beijing kept building, kept spending, kept preparing. Everyone believed China's military buildup was just posturing. Markets assumed Beijing wanted stability. Analysts told us economic interdependence would keep the peace. Diplomats insisted engagement was working. They were all utterly wrong. Beijing, September 3rd, 2025. Chinese soldiers are marching through Tiananmen Square in a military parade that sends a message not just to Taiwan, but to every nation watching from the Pacific. Standing before the camera, Xi Jinping delivers the same phrase he has repeated dozens of times since 2018. We are facing stormy seas. Be ready for war. Be ready to fight a war at any time. Translation: this is not a metaphor. This is not theater. This is a strategic declaration, and it has been hiding in plain sight for 7 years. And what has Australia done about it? That, dear viewers, is exactly what we need to talk about tonight. Dear viewers, let me give you some numbers, because in geopolitics, numbers don't lie. For 30 consecutive years, China has increased its military budget at twice the rate of its economic growth. Let that sink in. Not matching economic growth. Twice the rate. Hudson Institute senior fellow John Lee, who published a landmark analysis in February 2026, describes this as the fastest and largest peacetime rearmament program by any nation in 200 years of recorded economic history. 200 years! Not since Napoleon, not since the Kaiser, not since Hitler's rearmament of Germany in the 1930s has a nation restructured its military spending with this kind of speed and ambition during a period of formal peace. And right now, China spends more on its military each year than the next 22 Indo-Pacific economies combined. That's not a rival. That's a category of its own. Beijing has also entrenched what it calls civil-military fusion, a policy that means any commercial asset, any private technology, any corporation operating in China can be seized and commandeered by the state for military purposes. Every Chinese tech company, every shipping firm, every telecommunications giant, all of it available to the PLA at a moment's notice. Now ask yourself, when was the last time Australia's government explained this to its citizens in plain language? Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Australia's population is under 28 million people. China's is 1.4 billion. Australia's GDP is roughly 1/10 of China's. Its military budget, the same ratio. Former Prime Minister Paul Keating has spent years arguing that standing up to China militarily is like, and I'm quoting directly here, throwing toothpicks at a mountain. And here's the thing. On pure numbers, he's not wrong. But he's asking the wrong question, because the question isn't whether Australia can defeat China in a head-to-head military confrontation. No serious strategist is arguing that. The real question, the one that keeps defense planners awake in Canberra, is this: what does Australia look like if China wins? Let me paint that picture for you, because this is not speculation. This is already documented. In November 2020, the Chinese embassy in Canberra issued a list of 14 grievances to justify economic punishment against Australia. Not 14 demands related to military tensions. Not 14 objections to trade policy. 9 of those 14 grievances, 9, concerned Australia's domestic policies. Beijing demanded Australia silence media critical of China. It demanded Australia remove restrictions on Chinese firms purchasing Australian assets. It demanded that think tanks, independent research institutions, be defunded if they criticize Chinese government policies. It demanded that Huawei be permitted to dominate Australia's critical infrastructure. This was not a rival making strategic demands. This was a dominant power issuing compliance instructions to a subordinate. And China hadn't even won yet. So imagine, for a moment, what those demands look like if Beijing achieves economic and military dominance across the Indo-Pacific. Iron ore purchased at prices far below global market rates. Mineral and agricultural assets acquired without restriction. An exclusive Chinese military presence entrenched across the South Pacific. Shipping lanes controlled. Australian firms punished every time Canberra makes a decision Beijing dislikes. Chinese diaspora communities in Australia openly monitored, surveilled, reported on by agents operating with Beijing's blessing and impunity. You don't need to imagine how this ends. Just look at Cambodia. Look at Laos. Look at how much sovereignty those nations have retained since entering Beijing's economic orbit. The answer is not much. So why does AUKUS matter? Why does Australia's defense spending matter when the numbers seem so lopsided? Because geography is a weapon, and Australia holds one of the most powerful geographic positions on Earth. Japan is what strategists call the northern anchor of the US-led alliance in the Pacific. Australia is the southern anchor. What does that mean in practice? It means Australia's bases in the Northern Territory can store munitions, fuel, and strategic supplies for Allied forces across the region. It means Western Australian shipyards can service Allied submarines and surface vessels, keeping more ships operational and in the fight at any given moment. It means Australian territory hosts the satellite infrastructure, the surveillance assets, and the F-35 basing that modern military operations in the Pacific cannot function without. In a prolonged conflict, and John Lee is explicit about this, a war over Taiwan, if it comes, will not be won or lost in the first week. It will be decided by supply chains, by logistics, by which side can sustain operations across thousands of kilometers of ocean for months or years. That is where Australia becomes irreplaceable. China doesn't need Australia to be neutral. China needs Australia to be irrelevant, which is precisely why Beijing has spent years urging Canberra to step back from AUKUS, to distance itself from Washington, to stay on the sidelines. A neutral Australia doesn't just remove a military asset from the board, it removes the southern anchor from the entire Pacific alliance. And without both anchors, the US cannot sustain its position in Asia. Not alone. Translation: Australia's strategic choices in the next 5 years may be the single most consequential variable in determining whether war in the Pacific is deterred or becomes inevitable. Now, here's the part that no one in Canberra wants to say out loud. Australia's current defense budget does not allow it to play this role. The infrastructure, the submarines, the stockpiles, the readiness, none of it is where it needs to be. And as Lee argues in his February 2026 analysis, don't blame Donald Trump for that. Trump's accusation that Allied free riding weakens collective deterrence is uncomfortable, but it's correct. The logic is simple. The more Australia invests in its own defense, the more credible it becomes as an anchor. The more credible it is as an anchor, the more America is willing and able to maintain its commitment to the Pacific. The reverse is also true. A hollow alliance, underfunded and unserious, is not a deterrent. It's an invitation. Xi Jinping believes something specific about the West. He says it every time he meets Vladimir Putin. Great changes, unseen for a century, are occurring. He means the decline of Western influence. He means that liberal democracies are too divided, too indulgent, too distracted to respond to what is coming. He is betting that Australia will not fund AUKUS seriously. He is betting that Japan will hesitate. He is betting that Washington's domestic politics will fracture the alliances that have kept the Pacific stable for 80 years. He must be proved wrong. And here is why this matters beyond strategy, beyond budgets, beyond defense white papers. Australia's independence, its ability to make sovereign decisions about its own economy, its own institutions, its own people, is not guaranteed by geography alone. It is not protected by being far away. It is protected by the credibility of what Australia is willing to defend. The 14 grievances from 2021 were not a warning. They were a preview. The question Australia is answering right now, with every dollar invested in AUKUS, with every decision about the Darwin base, with every conversation in the alliance, is whether it intends to remain a sovereign nation capable of making its own choices, or whether it is content to find out, gradually, what happens when it doesn't. History has a very consistent answer to that question, and Xi Jinping is counting on Australia for getting it. Don't let him be right. If you found tonight's analysis valuable, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because the decisions being made in Canberra right now will define Australia's place in the world for the next century. This is the story that matters, and we're just getting started.